freezes to death in refrigeration unit. These were some headlines from 1964, and the headlines in themselves aren't particularly startling, but the story behind the headlines was startling. And what had actually happened was that a bloke had got trapped in a refrigeration unit as the door slammed shut behind him. And when he was found, he had all the physical symptoms of having frozen to death. What was surprising was that the refrigeration unit was actually turned off, and at no time was the temperature in the unit anywhere near zero, anywhere near freezing. So what had actually happened was that he'd believed that he was going to freeze to death, and his mind had created all the physical climate. It had actually produced hypothermia in him, and therefore he'd frozen to death. Mind, body, same system, do you think? There are lots of examples, aren't there, of the placebo effect. Here's one. In 1979, they did an experiment on some patients with severely bleeding ulcers. And they actually split the patients into two groups. And the first group, they told them that they were going to give them a drug that would give them immediate relief from the symptoms. And the second group, they gave them a drug and told them that it was an experimental drug that might work. And they actually gave them both groups the same drug. The first group, 75% of them had improved conditions, and in the second group, only 25% of them improved. And the only difference was their expectations. Here's another example. At Harvard University, Dr. Beecher was doing some research into pain control with post-operative patients. And he did an experiment where he gave one group of patients some morphine and he gave another group of patients a placebo. And the patients that took the morphine, 52% of them actually experienced some relief from the symptoms. In the group that took the placebo, 40% of them experienced some relief from the symptoms. That's 75% as effective as the actual morphine itself. So what had actually happened with these patients was that they believed that they were going to get some relief from the pain. So their brain actually created endorphins, which are opiate chemicals that actually blocked the neurotransmitters from transmitting the pain from the part of the body where the pain was to the brain. Amazing. So there's obviously something going on with this mind-body relationship, isn't there? Let's have a look at this. These are neurons, and it all starts with a thought. It does. That's what happens. We have a thought, and let me just take you through the process then. So the thought transmits an electrical impulse which runs through our neurons, and eventually it gets to the end of the neuron, the end of the dendrite as it's called, and it hits the synaptic gap. Now the synaptic gap, as it says, is chemical, so the electrical impulse comes in, it's carried by the neurotransmitters across the synaptic gap, so chemically across the synaptic gap to the next neuron. The electrical impulse is fired off again, and it goes through that neuron as well. So what we should bear in mind is that we each have about 100 billion neurons, and each of these neurons has something like 7,000 synaptic connections. That's an awful lot of connections. So that's basically what's happening, the science behind what's actually happening. The amazing news is that neurotransmitters are all over our body. They're not just in our mind as was originally thought. They're actually all over our body. So every cell in our body has these chemical neurotransmitters. And Deepak Chopra, who in the 80s wrote a book called Quantum Healing, actually says that every cell in our body is eavesdropping on our internal dialogue. So think about that when next time you're giving yourself some personal coaching, some messages. Make sure that your messages are positive, because your body's listening in. Positive self-talk, positive internal dialogue really is so important to our successful future. One of the best examples of this was that 152 cancer patients in America at Travis Air Force Base in California were consulted by their doctors as to whether they had a positive or a negative expectation of whether the treatment would work. And almost without exception, the people with a positive expectation actually responded better to their treatment. In fact, only 2 people who'd expressed negative expectations actually responded at all to any of their treatment. And the physician who was in charge of this actually was led to say, as a result of this, that he thought that a positive attitude towards the treatment actually had more of an effect on whether the treatment worked or not than the severity of the disease itself. And that's kind of amazing.